Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Brian Ferriso, the director here, and this has been a great opportunity for me. So I'm inviting you to help or to be part of the exploration and understanding of our fascinating careers and background of our curators. It's always fun for me to learn, and I love working here at the museum because I learn something new every day. And today, just preparing for this discussion with Maribeth, I learned tons, and I'm so excited to share it with you and her background. And she's been such an important part of this institution for a number of years. So it's very exciting for me to share that with you all and to be part of it. We have a little bit of a general idea of what the schedule will look like. We'll talk a little bit about Maribeth's background and then some of her academic career. And then we'll look into what happened here at the museum under her tenure and a little bit of the future, similar to the conversations with the other curators. That's what we're looking at. And then also have a question and answer. I think that's fun. So we'll try to have our conversation be a half hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll take some questions at the end. But before we get into the slides, I think it's always very important to give a little brief overview of our curators, their academic backgrounds, their experiences, and I want to read some of Maribeth's CV. Since 2007, Maribeth Graybill has served as the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Asian Art. She is responsible for the acquisition, display, and interpretation of the museum's collection of Asian as well as Islamic art. She oversees gallery rotations of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Pan-Asian sacred art, as well as thematic exhibitions on topics varied as Persian narrative, painting, ancient Chinese bronzes, and the arts of the Japanese Noh drama. She's been responsible for such notable acquisitions as masterworks of Japanese painting, I'm sure some of you have seen those, ceramics and lacquer, Chinese painting and calligraphy, Korean textiles and ceramics, and a collection of Islamic ceramics. She is fluent in Japanese, and you'll learn a little bit more about that. And her primary research areas are Japanese paintings and prints. In 2011, she curated the major exhibition, The Artist's Touch, The Craftsman's Hands, 3 Centuries of Japanese Prints from the Portland Art Museum, a spectacular show featuring over 250 works dating from the 1680s to the present. She also co-authored and edited the nearly 350-page catalog. In 2013, she hosted and curated and designed the installation for Samurai Armor from the Anne and Gabrielle Barbier-Mueller collection. And more recent exhibitions include the Chinese section of In Passionate Pursuit, the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer collection and legacy, and that was in 2014, Hand and Wheel, contemporary Japanese clay from 2014, and Breaking Barriers, Japanese women print artists from 1950 to 2000, and that was in 2015. Prior to joining the museum here in Portland, she served for 6 years as the Senior Curator of Asian Art at the University of Michigan, a Museum of Art, for those of you familiar with that great museum in Ann Arbor. And then from 1981 to 2000, she taught Japanese and Asian art at the undergraduate and graduate levels at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Swarthmore College. Dr. Graybill holds an MA in Japanese Studies and a PH.D. in Japanese Art History from the University of Michigan. And I am so thrilled she's with us today because Maribeth has been one of, I think, my first hires when I came. And I want to relay a little bit of a story. When I arrived in 2006, I sat down with the late Harold Schnitzer and Arlene Schnitzer, and Harold said to me, "Brian, when are we going to get a curator of Asian art? The great Donald Jenkins had just retired," and I looked at Harold and I said, "Well, I think it would be better to recruit a very high quality curator of Asian art if the position was endowed. So why don't you give us $2 million to fund that?" And he said, "Okay." And he gave us $2 million, and then we had an incredible application pool and of candidates, and Maribeth applied, and I met her, and we knew right away that that was our candidate. And for those of you who have gotten to know her over the last 10 years, 11 years at the museum, you realize her deep passion and her commitment, and she's created something very, very special here at the museum, almost a cornerstone of what we've done. So, how did she get here, and what was her journey? And I was with you, Maribeth, in I think it was when we were in Korea, and I said, how did you study Japanese art? How did this happen? And then you told me the story, but I've learned more. So let's jump right into it. And here's a picture of a very generic, basic-looking high school. So
Yes.
What does this mean?
Okay, before I jump in, I want to thank you, Brian, for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming, and say how thrilled I am to be here in Portland, now just a little bit more than 10 years. People do often ask, how did you get interested in Japanese art, as if that were something unusual or strange. I think ichthyology is a much more weird field to specialize in. But it's also one where you do not require that the professors be fish. But in any case, to answer that question of how I got here, I grew up in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. It's an hour east of Pittsburgh, about a half an hour from Arnie Palmer's home golf course. And this is my high school. I Googled it this afternoon. It looks exactly as it looked when I was enrolled there. I'll let you do the math and figure out how long ago that was. So this is where I matriculated, and I got good grades, but I was otherwise a very ordinary and unhappy person because I didn't have any of the skills that American culture cherishes. I could not hit a softball. Anyway, there's a long list of things that I was incapable of. But so I took refuge in books. As a little girl, I read, Kipling and 1001 Nights, and then I studied French. So I applied for the American Field Service Exchange Program. I wanted to get out of Greensburg. My whole life has been about getting out of Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And so I went to Japan between my junior and senior year in high school, and I was sent to Takarazuka, which is the home of Japan's famous all-women's review. And I ask you to notice the difference between this and Greensburg, Pennsylvania. And the next. Okay, now while I was there, I was just for a summer, and I spoke virtually no Japanese. I had a phrase book. I learned how to say, I'm sick, 2 tickets to Kobe, that kind of thing. But my host family took me, of course, to a number of requisite tourist sites. And we went to Nara, the 8th century capital of Japan. And these aren't my photographs, those were slides in those days. But this is the Great Buddha, which was originally built in the middle of the 8th century, and it's been repaired many times, which is why it's really ugly. But in any case, I memorized that this was 49 feet tall and weighed X number of tons, and so on and so forth, and that it's in the world's largest building, because when I came back to Greensburg, Pennsylvania, having been sent abroad on public funds, I was expected to report on my experience. So as a senior in high school, I'm standing on stage lecturing to the Kiwanis Club, and I had memorized these facts about Japan has the world's largest bronze sculpture of Buddha, and it's 49 feet tall. The die was cast. The die was cast. So that's in high school. And then when time came to choose a college, I expected to be a biologist, but I chose a college that would allow me to spend my junior year in Japan. This is a college in Ohio. It's like any other small liberal arts college in Ohio. And then I went my junior year in Tokyo. Again, notice the difference. So I spent my junior year at Waseda University in Japan. And for me, as a young, insecure, kind of egghead female, Japan was freedom. My person was free. It was one of the safest countries in the world. I never had to worry about being personally or physically attacked. There were times when I was traveling in a rush and I left my camera and my wallet in the train station, and I went back and they handed it to me half an hour later. There was probably the world's best public transportation system there. I could, as all college students did, I could go anywhere in the country and I could go by myself. I could stay at a youth hostel for $5. People who know me would be surprised to learn that I hiked, I climbed mountains. Yes, that's really true, about my distant past. But the point is, Japan gave me such incredible freedoms that I would never have. I didn't have a car in my hometown of Western Pennsylvania or at my small liberal arts college. I I could go anywhere, I could do anything. And I was with a wonderful host family, but because it was a host family situation, they're not telling me what to do. I had to decide how to spend my time. And so that is, I would say, the transformative experience of my life.
Maribeth, talk a little bit about the language, because this was very important at this time too. How did you learn it? What was the access? And were you studying it in college and then went over?
They didn't offer Japanese at my college. Actually, it was very few places in the country offered it then, in the 60s. But I had learned a smidgen in that high school time. And the interesting thing is that many, many years later, after formal training, I still spoke in the accent of my first home family, because that had entered my brain. But my junior year in college was essentially the summer before and after, so it was 14 months, and I was studying Japanese intensively the whole time. So taking intensive classes and living with a host family and living in Japan, I came back with the equivalent of what in the States would have been more than 3 years of college Japanese. So I came back, so while I was there, you go on to the next slide, we had to do a project. And my brother is an architect, and in college when I was taking French, my project was to write about Corbusier. So I thought, okay, my project will be to look at contemporary Japanese architecture, because Corbusier was one of many influences for them. So that was my excuse to travel all over the country. This is right in Tokyo. This is Kenzo Tangei's Olympic Stadium from '64. And this is Maekawa Kunio's Tokyo Culture Hall, 1961. But I did go all over the country photographing city halls and sort of other public buildings and houses. But again, if you think about these two buildings, Kenzo Tango and Maekawa Kunio, there was nothing like that in the entire state of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and to the best of my knowledge, there isn't anything like that in Pennsylvania or Ohio now. So I think you can see why I was happy to find myself in an entirely stimulating new world.
Yeah, and this is important too, is because Maribeth, when we work with her here at the museum, she's so thoughtful about space, orientation, architecture. You're always thinking about it. You're a great person for me to run things by, and she's really helpful. And knowing your background and your interest in this area is so important.
So let's kind of jump ahead to graduate school. I came back and I decided that I needed to know more, and so I went to the University of Michigan and did MA in Japanese Studies first. That involved another year of intensive Japanese, and then I went for a PhD in Japanese art history, and that involved actually 3 more years, 2 years in Kyoto and a year in Tokyo. And this is the man who's kind of at the heart of my doctoral dissertation. This is the retired Emperor Gotoba, who lived at the very end of the 12th and early 13th century. And we believe that this is a portrait sketched by a courtier, Fujiwara Nobuzane, seated in his presence. And some of the reasons that we think about that is because of sort of the history that's come down around it, but because, and it's almost impossible to see, but because if you look at how the portrait is drawn, is this going to be it? Here, coming down the outline of the face. It's not drawn the way that a professional artist would draw a figure in a romance tale, which is going to be a single line, swoop, swoop, that comes down brow and cheek. It's lots and lots and lots of little feathery lines. He's using the brush the way you almost kind of think of using a pastel. You get the sense, and whether it's true or whether it's just the discourse of the painting, he's sketching. As though he's sketching from life, as though the guy is right in front of him, but you can't say the guy about an emperor. One of the reasons why this portrait is so important is that of the many things that Japan learned and eagerly adopted from China, secular portraiture was not one of them. We find portraiture in Japan of monks, but they're sort of quasi-religious, saints anyway. But secular portraiture does not become a part of political rhetoric. But this emperor, Gotoba, commissioned this painter, Fujiwara Nobuzane, to do sketches of events events such as poetry competitions, and copies of these survive. And in these, it's a funny analogy, but think of the coronation of Napoleon. And one of the things that painting does is it records for posterity who was there and how close they were standing to the emperor. Well, the paintings that Gotoba had Fujiwara Nobuzane record, or poetry competitions, where he's sitting in the palace, and is totally appropriate, you can't see him. He's obscured by a screen, because you never, never, never look upon the emperor's face. He only looks at you. But then around him are all the courtiers arranged by high rank, and then Fujiwara Nobuzane is the very last guy, practically outside the door. So we know that this painter specialized in doing portraits of his fellow courtiers. That's something new in his time. And we know that he would accompany Gotoba on hawking parties. He would come to various things. But the story about this portrait is the night before Gotoba goes into exile, and he was sent into exile because he tried to foment a rebellion against the uprising warrior class. He failed. The night before he goes into exile, he calls in Nobuzane. He said, would you please make a portrait of me for my mom, for my mother? And so this might be a copy, but the point is, it's kind of the beginning of a secular tradition of portraiture. And the other part is that this same guy, Nobuzane, seems to be, could we go on to the next one, involved in creating an entire genre of painting, which is imaginary portraits of poets of the past. And this is actually a work that's going to be in our exhibition that's coming up this fall, the collection of Mary and Jeannie Coles. But so my dissertation and my research focused around this period in Japan, the end of the 12th, the early 13th century, huge social upheaval as courtly culture is losing out to warriors, and how portraiture and poetry and the relationship between those becomes part of a visual rhetoric about trying to hold on to the values of court culture. So that's a huge chunk. Okay, then.
Your first job at Berkeley.
First job is at Berkeley. I was not remotely prepared, but anyway, isn't that always the case with first jobs? So I was at Berkeley from 1981 to 1989. What I loved about teaching there is that as a state school, tuition was quite reasonable for in-state people. And there was a very strong sense of California and Berkeley, and the Bay Area in particular, being Pacific Rim. California was already close to 1/4 Asian in population. An enormous Asian presence on campus. But part of what that meant was that being interested in Asia was as normal as having dim sum for breakfast. Now that's not true. It's the Rockies. If you are not in a California or West Coast school, and I don't care, you can be at Harvard, you can be at the University of Chicago, you can be at the University of Michigan, but Asian Studies is a group that self-selects and self-identifies. In California, I would have Italian kids come into my classes, I would have Thai kids come into my classes and said, Grandma said I should study something Asian. And they were, so they take medieval Japanese ink painting. And so it was incredibly, validating to sort of be in a state where the study of Asia seemed like a thing that rational people would do all the time.
Yeah, and if you know Maribeth and you're around her a lot, you sense the ability. She's an incredible teacher, and I think it starts here, and it then continues on at Swarthmore. I mean, you've been such a great educator for us here at the museum and in the community.
So I didn't get tenure at Berkeley because I didn't write the book. And those of you who know that I'm struggling to finish a book now will understand that it goes back that far. So I went off to Swarthmore, which is a superb, small liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia, and was one of 4 art historians. I was the only person on campus who was a Japan specialist. I had a colleague who taught Chinese history. I have to say that most of my colleagues who taught at Swarthmore thought they had died and gone to heaven. It's a wealthy college, it has brilliant students, but it was not a good fit for me because it's so small that there was not a critical mass for students to be interested in Asia. I kept dreaming up new courses on Asia every year, and I kept getting nobody to enroll. And what the department wanted me to do was three out of 5 courses a year, being an introduction that looked at art history as a discipline. So I really enjoyed the first 4 years of reading feminist theory and Michael Baxendale, and that was fun, and learning how to teach that was enjoyable. But the other thing was that freshman art history in any discipline in Swarthmore is really writing intensive, so I spent a lot of time telling people what paragraphs are. Yes, I was happy to leave.
Yeah, and so we back to Ann Arbor, where you did your PhD,
right.
And was in a much more, probably a larger environment, a larger academic environment, and then also the great museum there, which you had a big impact on. Talk about what we're looking at here, Maribeth.
So towards the latter part of my time at Swarthmore, I had a sabbatical, and I decided to spend it in Ann Arbor. And I had a ball. I audited a seminar on Tibetan Buddhism, taught a class on Buddhist art. It was just really wonderful, and a lot of friends from graduate school had actually gravitated back to Ann Arbor. And while I was there, the person who had been the only curator of Asian art, Marshall Wu, announced his retirement. And a lot of my friends in Ann Arbor said, Maribeth, why don't you apply? There's a new president of the university. He's really pro the arts. And I thought it was crazy, but I did, and they hired me at a very advanced age, which was a real surprise. And so I went back to Ann Arbor, but now as curator of Asian art, and it was tremendous fun. And I'm showing you here 2 pieces from one of the best days in my life. There was a endowment that created about $45,000 a year for the purchase of Asian art. And the director of the museum, who had worked very hard to eliminate any remote influence from faculty about acquisitions, or really pretty much anybody else, allowed us to go to auctions. And at Christie's, in that one day, I bought, on the left, it's about 5 feet tall, a standing 10th century image of Vishnu, to my mind, the most conversion-worthy image of Vishnu I have ever seen. I have kowtowed in front of this many times. 10th century. I bought a Khmer Dynasty bronze conch shell, 12th century, and its stand, 13th century. And I bought a 12th century Tibetan Kadampa stupa, I don't have a picture of that, all for under $40,000. And I was pretty happy. I was pretty happy.
Wonderful objects, really beautiful. So then, the Portland Art Museum.
Yes. Right.
And again, as I mentioned, what a great appointment we made in having you come here. And so it's been a real wonderful journey. And one thing I have to say is, when we were looking at the department in particular, as many of you may know, Dr. Donald Jenkins had led our museum in the Asian area so wonderfully for a number of years. And Donald was curator emeritus and continues to be today. So the question was, how do we celebrate Donald? How do we continue his legacy, but at the same time celebrate the core of our collection in Japanese prints? And that was the first project that Maribeth undertook and did it so beautifully. So talk about what that looked like, Maribeth, and how it went.
Well, when I came in, Bruce Gunther, who was then the chief curator, sat me down and walked me through the fact that, Donald had spent his last several years as curator working towards this dream goal of publishing a collection of our entire collection of Japanese prints. He thought it would be 3 volumes, and anyway. So Bruce and I decided that we couldn't possibly tackle that. But even in figuring out what to do, the vast majority of the collection had not been photographed. It had been cataloged in the 1950s. Oh, I should say, the collection begins with an enormous gift of 750 prints that came in 1932 from the family of Mary Andrews Ladd, and Donald, of course, had grown it considerably since then. So I brought in Lynn Katsumoto, who had been Donald's research assistant, and we spent 3 years just going through the Japanese print collection. It had to be measured for the first time. We took our own little snapshot photographs of it. The museum did not have an in-house photographer. And when we began this process, curators couldn't put data in the database. Registrars controlled entry to the database because curators had so badly mucked it up in the past. We now have a more enlightened administration on that point of view. So the point is, I spent 3 years without filing taxes and barely brushing my teeth to work on this book. But I'm really proud of it because I think that we learned a great deal about our collection. And one of the things that was very rewarding, this was on view from October 2011 on, is that lead print scholars from Japan and from the East Coast came, and they pointed out something which I did not have a perspective, which is that the sort of shape of our collection is quite different from collections on the East Coast or collections in the center of the country, where a lot of people were going to the same dealers, or Frank Lloyd Wright was influential, and so forth. Because Mary Andrews Ladd was buying from, as near as I can tell, from a dealer who would come up from San Francisco with prints in his suitcase. So it was a different source. It sort of came out of Japan a different way. She just ran across different material. So even though our collection, I'll just give today's numbers because I don't remember what they were in 2011, the collection stands at about 3,800 now. MFA Boston is 66,000. Art Institute of Chicago is more than 23,000. We have prints that they don't have. And we have 18th century prints that they don't have. And the other thing that makes our collection unique, and this is due in no small part to Gordon Gilkey, but other patrons like Carolyn Seymour Haber, we have one of the largest collections of post-war Japanese prints. So, I didn't know that until I was working on this collection, and nobody would have known it because we didn't have, when I started, we didn't have the adequate tools to collect it. By the time I was done, we had a database, we had a really good team, university, campus-wide, to sort of put that into place. So, and in the meantime, I know that this has been used as a textbook in classes across the country and in Europe.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing. What's so exciting to see this again, Maribeth, because it did take us forward institutionally, the systems and how to do work like this. But also, I will never forget this story. I think you and Bruce traveled up to Seattle 2 to 3 times just to check the coloration and the proofs on this. So if you have this catalog, the coloration and the printing quality is so high, it's really special. It was, a real commitment to making sure that the legacy of the exhibition and the prints are duplicated in a very beautiful way, and it's a great result, and something that will continue on that show. And I asked Maribeth to talk a little bit about some of her acquisition highlights and things that were special to her in the collection as well.
So one of the things that happened as we were working on the print show, dealers learned about it, and they would come to us and show us things. But also local collectors heard about it. And this print is one of the most famous prints by Chico Shitall, who is credited as sort of being the founder of the creative print movement in Japan. This is a movement in which, unlike traditional Japanese printing, where a publisher comes up with an idea, he commissions an artist to do a sketch, the artist does the sketch, and then professionals are engaged to cut the blocks and do the actual printing. In the creative print movement, which is inspired by actually what Japanese learned about German prints from magazines, the artist does everything. I mean, he comes up with a design, he figures out how to print it. And Onchi is this genius who he doesn't really teach, but his house is a salon where younger artists come. But this is one of his most famous prints, done very early in the post-war years. And this Mr. Donald Williams, who lives west of town in Beaverton, I believe, came in to see us and said he was in Japan as the occupation, and somebody said to him, "I know a great print artist, you should come meet him." And he went out and he met Onchi and he bought it from him in person. So, and he gave it to us, and so it was perfect. It was perfect timing to be in the exhibition, and it was thrilling to have that come. So that was a gift. And since then, we've worked hard to continue with significant purchases. One of Donald Jenkins' favorite artists, and he wrote a seminal article about him way back in the early 80s, early 90s, is Suzuki Nobu, who is at the center of a revolution towards using full color, which we define as 5 or more blocks, in single sheet prints. There had been color previously in printed books, but in the single sheet prints, this was new. And this is a work that has, the color is in spectacular condition. Now, why am I talking about it that way? That's because the color in Japanese prints all the way until the 19th century is vegetable pigments, which means that it fades very easily. It's not just exposure to sunlight, it's exposure to air. It fades very rapidly. Look at the yellows. And it might be hard to see where you are, but that's purple. It's true purple, and the greens. So I think Brian remembers this print was at the Japanese print fair, and I was sort of having these public orgasms in front of the print. But
Gotta get
anyway,
it.
yeah, so we bought it.
We got it.
And then another one, I have a thing for Japanese samurai. I read samurai historical novels for fun. And I got this one just because I love this character. He's truly outrageous. This is a guy he was a very, very savvy military general. And he did what you had to do to survive in those days, which is he changed sides all the time. But in any case, he had been on the side that was defeated by Oda Nobunaga, a great general and unifier of Japan. So he conceded, okay, I give up. Yes, you're in charge. I will follow you. And then he retreats down to a little castle south of modern Osaka. And all is well, but then there comes a time when Nobunaga asks him to take charge of a certain campaign, and he switches sides. He fights against Nobunaga. And things come to a very, very difficult head. Somehow or other he gets out of it and he's forgiven. And then he does it again. So on the second time, Nobunaga's forces surround his castle, and he knows that the jig is up. So what he does is he said, I'll be damned if he's going to have any of my tea ceremony objects. And so he smashes them to smithereens, and then he commits suicide. And so here he is, smashing his tea objects. Oops, I'm going to lose my... So much for gesturing. Anyway, I had to have it for that reason.
So that led to this.
Yes. So then, so this is our suit of armor, and this has a funny story too. We normally don't buy things at auction because we strongly prefer to have them here and approved by our collections committee beforehand. But this year at Christie's, they had some beautiful lacquered drum handles dated to about 1600. And they were very reasonable, and I wanted more lacquer. So I brought in the catalog, and I showed it to Bruce Gunther. And he looked at it, and you could sort of tell that it didn't move his meter very far. But he flipped the page, and on the next page, he saw this. So he really loved it. And then he took it upstairs to Brian. So they said, go look at this, go look at this. And I did, and we bought it. Can I say the price?
Yeah, sure.
For $100,000 hammer price.
That's a bargain.
I still think so. I still think so. But, on my own, I would not have thought, I kind of follow the policy of trying to live within my means. This might surprise some people, but I try to live within means, and I'm obsequious. I'm very sweet that way. So I wouldn't have thought of this, but with Bruce and Brian's encouragement, we went after this. And it has been such a hoot. I never in a million years imagined that I would handle leather skirts, but it is in fact a leather skirt. Taking this apart and learning how to put it together and learning what the pieces are, I came to see that armor is this sort of encyclopedia of all of the crafts that go into Japanese art. There's metalwork, there's textiles, there is work with leather, lacquer, and our suit, it was put together, completed, assembled in 1740s. Anyway, the longer I live with it, the more I am delighted with this purchase because I think it's an extremely fine example. And so this was a total fluke, but great fun.
Yeah, and today it continues to delight. You can see it upstairs now, and with the Leica exhibition, it's a great compliment to that. And I always see kids and families and general audiences just really appreciating this piece. Great acquisition.
Another area that has been fun to move into is thinking about contemporary art. And I am not qualified and not seeking to represent the whole span of what's happening in the art scene in Asia today. But what I do look for is artists who are working in traditional media and giving that a contemporary spin. And this is one example. This is a painting, it's about 10 feet by 3 feet by Luo Jianwu. We found it at Kaiko Do, a dealer we visit often in New York. And his brushwork is just absolutely extraordinary. This is a piece that he worked on for 5 years, and I was so stunned when we saw it in the gallery, and we bought it a few years ago. But what's fun about it, if you push, is he designed it to be looked at from any angle. So he didn't mount it as a hanging scroll, so we actually framed it, and he has signatures facing in all 4 directions, so we can change how we decide to display it. So that's one of the contemporary pieces. Another one is this magnificent ceramic sculpture by Fuji Casa Satoko. And this purchase was supported by the Asian Art Council, and it gives me a time to sort of thank them for being, the Asian Art Council has, over the course of history, funded in entirety or in part the acquisition of more than 200 works of Asian art, as well as supporting programs that we do. But this piece is not on view right now because the current exhibition tries to look at early decades of collecting Japanese art here. But what I have loved is that when it is on view, many people tweet it as their favorite piece in the museum, a young female artist. And this is an example of, again, sort of more recent art, 1932. But this came to us a few years ago. It's a large Japanese screen painting, one of a pair from Mary and Cheney Coles, who are collectors in Seattle. And it's their collection that will be featuring in a major exhibition this fall. So one of the things that this allows us a chance to segue into is how, over the course of a decade, one of the most emotionally enriching things has been developing relationships not only in the local community, but also with collectors and supporters outside of Portland who are invested in our future.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about when you started was how do we increase the selection of paintings? That was very important, and I think we've done a really good job with that, and the need to rotate them. So it was 2 years ago we got that letter. And Maribeth called me up and said, Brian, I got a letter from the cultural agencies in Korea, and we have in our possession a stolen painting. What do we do? And I said, well, let me see the letter. We sit down, and it was like, what happened? How did this emerge? We never knew that letter would lead to one of the great adventures I think we took together as a team, and I think we also have Sangha Kim here with us in the museum of repatriating or working with a collector to repatriate this very, very iconic Buddhist painting back to the Sangwasai Monastery in southern Korea. So here is the painting. Some of you may recall it. Let's talk briefly about this story, Maribeth, and a little bit about how it went from Korea to the Portland Art Museum and then back to Korea.
Yeah. Are the Mattiellis here tonight? I don't think I see them. But many of you probably know Bob and Sandra Mattielli. They lived in Korea for 3 decades. Bob was hired by the 8th Army Division, which is resident in Korea, to operate art workshops, art classes throughout the country for American GIs stationed in Japan. When I found that out, my opinion of the military, American military really shot up, I have to say. But they taught painting, photography. It was just a place where American GIs who were stationed in Korea, often for long periods, could learn to do the arts. And in that job, he traveled around the country, and he became very quickly fascinated with Korean crafts. Anything that showed how the Koreans traditionally made something, he was interested in. So ceramics, paper, textiles, and he didn't really care terribly much about the condition. It was a time, he was there from the late 59 till 89, and at the beginning of that period, Korea was still quite impoverished. But at the end of that time, Korea was emerging as a major industrial international power. So over the course of those 30 years, he saw both individuals and institutions toss out old things, because who wants a bamboo basket when you can have a plastic one? So there was this wholesale discarding of the old, and he just gathered it in. And so he was regularly haunted the antique dealers at Insadong in Seoul. And one day he saw a guy bringing in on a cart a very handsome chest, and he just kind of followed the chest into the store. And the dealer, the proprietor, knew him. And he said, I'm really interested in that chest. And he said, well, it needs some repair, I'll let you know. So he went away, and he came back several days later and said, oh, so sorry, I sold it. But there was some junk inside it, you might look in that corner. So he goes back in the corner, and there he sort of gingerly picks up this thing that's folded about, sizes of about this big and filthy, and it was this painting. It had been folded into small, in square, and he said, well, I'll take this. You can have it for $10. So he took it, and then he took it to the gentleman who he had used for years as his mounter. And Bob's first thought was, well, maybe you can cut out a few fragments of it, and we'll just, keep some pieces. He said, no, I can fix this. So he cleaned the whole thing and put it out on a stretcher. And here you see it the way that it was restored in Korea in about the mid-1970s. So the patches that are white are where the restorer filled in holes with a cotton fabric. And this is how it was displayed, and it's about 5 feet high, how it was displayed in their living room in Seoul until they left in 1989, and then they brought it back to their house here. We had invited, or I guess a group from Korea volunteered to come and survey our collection in 2014 or 15. And I borrowed a number of Korean pieces from local collectors to have on site at the time, because I wanted to have them look at the works and advise us on whether we should bring them into the collection. So that's when a group of Korean scholars saw this, and then we got this letter, it's been stolen. Well, what we have learned since then, because the story is kind of complicated, is this painting was on a wall in a sort of meditation hall at Songgwangsa Monastery, and the building was remodeled. And where this painting hung, they made a doorway. So the painting was taken down and rolled up and apparently tucked away in a basement and forgotten. And so we don't know how it left the monastery, but if it had been stolen by somebody seeking to make a profit, it wouldn't have ended up in a drawer in a chest and been sold for $10. You see, but there was no question that it belonged to the monastery, because the government conducted a survey of paintings in 1970 or 71, and it's illustrated there. And then the government did a white paper about stolen paintings in the 1990s, and it was listed there. I mean, the funny part, as Matelies say, it was hanging in their living room where lots of people saw it for much of that time. Anyway, the Matelies were quite happy, to say, okay, we're happy to send it back to Korea. But then what we thought was, well, rather than just tucking it in the mail, let's make it a real opportunity for learning. So we asked the Korean government agencies and the monastery if they would support, first of all, us having an exhibition about it, secondly, a symposium about it, and then third, if they would support bringing the materialists to Korea to see the work in its new home. And they said yes to all of that.
And it's really, it was an incredible event. It was sort of this national treasure. I mean, they really embraced this. And I think I think they were surprised at our willingness to say, yeah, let's share this, or let's get this back. Let's get this back to where it belongs, its home. And it was very gratifying. It was a career highlight, I think, for me, and it's very special. Building on that, I think one of the things that Maribeth has done is created great international relations for this museum and this community, and built friendships across the country, if not more specifically to Asia. But also, I sort of have this running joke, she's created a museum within a museum. She's got a whole department to herself that she's bringing on new people, and she's a remarkable mentor. She has not only the great Jan Quivy assisting, but we've been able to bring on some really fabulous scholars. And I want to have Maribeth talk a little bit about Jeannie and her vision for the future moving forward, and where you're going to take us next.
Okay, so sort of thinking about where to go from here, I've been thinking for quite some time, especially the 125th anniversary becomes a good occasion for trying to articulate goals. And for quite some time, I've felt that it's important, and we sort of publicly state that it's important, to sustain an emphasis on Japanese prints. Here's a portrait of Mary Andrews Ladd, and as I mentioned earlier, it was her collection of more than 750 Japanese prints and printed books that entered the museum in 1932, and that's the year that the Belusky building went up, and the very first exhibition in one of the rooms, and I think it's the room where the later Chinese art is now, was an exhibition of her Japanese prints. That gift, there had been a few small Asian objects that had come into the collection beforehand, but that gave the museum what is to this day one of the most important chunks of critical mass of something, where not 4 of these and 5 of those, but there's enough in that collection because its emphasis is on 18th and 19th century up until about 1850. That there are many avenues, many interesting questions that can be explored, art historical questions, social questions, questions of production. And so I think that gift is what made Asia a meaningful part of this institution. And then the fact that Donald Jenkins, who was with this museum for 41 years, was one of the foremost scholars of Japanese prints in North America. Donald organized some major exhibitions on Japanese prints during his tenure. I think the most recent of them was the Floating World Revisited, where he borrowed things from all over North America, and a scholar of international stature. So I think that we should sustain that emphasis. But what I learned in the 3 years of working on the Artist Touch catalog is that cataloging Japanese prints is an exhausting and never-ending task. Since then, and right here near the front, I see Erwin Lavenberg, who's been a dedicated, fabulous volunteer intern who's come in and not only initially he took all that information that we wrote for the catalog and got that into our database, but continually researching the collection. But I knew that it wasn't enough. So when an announcement came out, now it's almost, a little bit more than a year ago, that the Japan Foundation was offering a grant for museum infrastructure that included staff expansion. Brian and I sat down and we thought about all kinds of things, but we decided that an assistant curator position focused on, not restricted to, but focused on Japanese prints would be the best way to go, and we got that. And I'm thrilled, and Jeannie, can I ask you to stand up, please? Stand up, please. Jeannie comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania, where she worked with Julie Davis, who's an Oregonian, I think. I had what I thought were ridiculously high standards for the position. We had 3 candidates who were all water walking amazing. They all came out, and we were all impressed by them. But after the candidates came, then we had difficulty deciding who would be the best. So I asked them, I sort of said, now that you've been here, what is your vision for how you would like to go forward? And we got by far the most thoughtful answer from Jeannie. So she has been a thrill to work with. So that's one.
That's one.
Then another is, and this is where I'd like to thank Sangha Kim. Sangha, would you stand up, please? Sangha has been with us for now about a little bit more than a year and a half as the Coles Curatorial Fellow in Asian Art. And she's native Korean, but also fluent in Chinese as well as English. And the original plan was that while I was working on other things, that I would have a curatorial fellow researching in Korean and Chinese, which are languages that I do not have, about our collection. And Sangha has done all that and so much more, so much more. She has really been kind of I can't think of the correct metaphor, but the core around which so much of programming has happened. She was essential in the 5 Buddhas project. We've had wonderful projects since then, bringing in Korean artists. Some of the relationships that we developed out of the 5 Buddhist projects with a monastery, with Buddhist sect in Korea, resulted in a lantern-making project. So that has really built our presence as a Korean collection and Korean programming. And the other area that has dramatically changed our Korean collection is the addition just in the past year of 18 spectacular works of Korean ceramics from Richard Brown. Do you want me to make you stand up, Richard? Anyway. So the Korean collection and the Korean area, which actually I should also thank Jung-hee Lee, who's in the audience. Jung-hee Lee worked with Donald Jenkins to kind of create out of nothing in the late 1990s. Now on its 20th anniversary is looking very good. So that's another, I'll keep going. Other things is we are anticipating a major gift of Japanese paintings over the next several years. And as Brian had mentioned, growing the paintings collection has always been one of my concerns, because Asian paintings can only be on view for a relatively short time period, and they need to be rotated. So we need a lot of them, and we are hopeful of getting a major gift in the near future.
And I think, as many of you know, with our planned, Rothko Pavillion, there's extensive renovations throughout this museum to really clarify our campus, but another really exciting part of this is that we really want to solidify our strength in Asian art, and I think a lot of what Maribeth has done with the team that she's assembled is really leading up to an opportunity for us to bring the galleries up, to modernize them even further, and to make them really quite spectacular. So that's a really exciting part, I think, of where we're trying to go with this. And the campaign is proceeding. We've got some other work to do, maybe some due diligence on the campaign, and hopefully within a year we'll have revised ideas about where we're going, more specifics, and in particular, perhaps more specifics about the Asian gallery. And one of the great things about this has been Maribeth has done a great census, or looking at other museums across the country and their display of Asian art, as well as across Asia. So we have some really exciting ideas. So stay tuned for that. And that's really, I guess, the next big part of where we're trying to go with the Asian collection. We owe so much to many people in this room, and you all have been so core to what we're trying to do, especially in this very important foundational area of the museum. That being said, happy to answer any questions if there are any. And I, first of all, before we do that, want to thank Maribeth for sharing her story with us. So thank you very much. And we have a question right here.
We're certainly lucky to have you, and having lived in Pittsburgh before coming here, I can resonate a little bit with your thoughts about Western Pennsylvania, that I'm sure they're sorry to have lost you. I have both a specific and a general question in relation to the art of China. Geopolitically, you might argue that this may be the century of China, if we look back, when people look back. And China was conspicuously not part of the discussion so far this evening. And there may be very good reasons of resources and collection development focus and so forth for that. But in light, certainly from my perspective, of the importance of fostering a greater understanding of China and its history and culture, both specific to what we do have in resources in Chinese art here, and as more of a philosophical question of how a museum such as ours could serve community understanding of culture, politics, civilization in China through its resources as an art museum. I wonder your thoughts.
Actually, I did show one Chinese piece, which is the contemporary painting by Luo Jianwu. My stance, both back when I was teaching and when I'm here, is to try and think in a Pan-Asian way as much as possible. But when it comes to acquisitions, one is shaped by circumstances beyond one's control. And in the China case, I didn't speak about this. I should have, but it was sort of before my time, so I didn't. But we have, of course, one of the finest collections in North America of Chinese funerary art from the Han Dynasty that comes from Arlene and Harold Schnitzer. And what is so wonderful about that, actually, I have been saying for a decade that that is the second critical mass in the Asian collection, where there's what we have enough Han Dynasty material, and it's a time when China is unified politically, and Confucian notions of honoring ancestors are honored throughout the entire state, that you can make very, very interesting, there are interesting stories to tell about political unification, but cultural difference within that, and it's regional. You can see the difference in our gallery between Sichuanese and Zhongyuan and Chu art, different parts of China. And so whenever I'm doing school tours, I often spend an hour in there and never get anyplace else, because I think, also because the fact that it's naturalistic, it's quite easy to grasp and understand. So we have that as an incredibly important gift. The difficulty with my arrival here has sort of coincided with the explosion of the Chinese art market. And on the one hand, so that, we just were in New York with Asia Week, and our group went and we spent some time looking at a beautiful black glazed dingware tea bowl that's got some wonderful splotches in the glaze, incredibly attractive. We have pieces similar to it that have been given us by local collectors that are on view in the gallery, but this was an exceptionally fine piece, and it went for $46 million.
I think there was an imperial piece yesterday that went for $35 million.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, it went for $46,000. My apologies, it went for $46,000.
But there was a piece that just went for
Yes.
$35 million.
Yeah, imperial porcelains will go for the multiple millions. So there have been two issues. One is the explosion of the Chinese art market, and when you go to auction, 99% of what's bought goes going back to China. Okay, and the second is a rethinking in the entire museum community about our responsibilities vis-a-vis excavated objects and self-imposed honorably self-imposed restrictions on what we will buy that is historical. So I will go to the dealers and I will go to the auctions in New York, and Chinese or Indian, Southeast Asian. I bought a Ganesh in my first full year here, second year here, and I have no hope of buying anything Indian ever again, a historical piece, because if I'm looking for provenance that proves that it was out of the country of origin by 1980, that means that it's only fair game, that it's fair game for museums. Now, private collectors do not have that restriction, but anyway, that's going to quintuple the price. So fundamentally, the Portland Art Museum is priced out of the Chinese market. That's why when I had the opportunity to buy the Luo Jianwu painting, I jumped at it. I look at Chinese ceramics always when I'm in New York at the dealers. And the situation is that I might see a Chinese, this year I saw a Chinese brown glazed jar this high, very cute, pull the heartstrings, would really love to have it, $40,000. And I think about what I can buy with $40,000. And usually the choice comes down to I can make a better choice. When we have modest resources for acquisition, I'm always trying to think about the piece that will make the most impact on the collection, a piece that tells a story, a piece that will unite things together in an interesting way, pieces that will, can last for a long time. So now, but also on the China front, if you go into our the sacred arts of Asia, we have a little cache of things that were, speaking in French here, looted from China at a time of great upheaval in the 30s and 40s, the Buddhist art back there. But we profited from that moment of looting. We have some great Chinese objects. The Buddhist sculptures, the Shang Dynasty bronze Hu is my favorite object in the whole museum, that fabulous Bactrian camel. We were making world-class purchases of Chinese art in the 40s and the 50s. And that day will come again. That day is not here now.
Well, it was a great question, too, because we're going to China in 2 weeks. So who knows? I mean, maybe something will come of it. Maribeth and I were invited on a special envoy to go and maybe create a partnership. But one of the things that's so interesting about China is some of the greatest treasures are actually in the United States because of the Cultural Revolution and the marketplaces that you talk about. It's hard to, we have over here some of the great treasures. They were lost in China. Thank you for that question.
Sorry, but my question is about China as well. Is there enough in the collection that it gets rotated here? And how often does it get rotated?
The only art that I try to rotate is works that are light sensitive. So we have not changed the Han Dynasty galleries. There have been some times when some things went back to the Schnitzer home, and so we've done a little bit of adjustment in there. But in the gallery, which is to the south side of the Park Avenue entrance, the Goodman Gallery, there's sort of two walls that I use for rotation there. And right now, there's a really exciting exhibition that Sangha Kim curated called Straddling Borders. And it's just an accident of things that came into the collection very, very recently. We have a suite of prints by Wang Gongyi, who's a really innovative, wonderful Chinese woman artist who has been living in Portland actually since, about 15 years now, or a bit longer. But this is when she started when she went to France and then came actually to Oregon. And most of them are actually lithographs. So you have a Chinese female artist who won international fame by doing woodcuts and then adopting a foreign technique and experimenting with new ideas and thinking about her Chinese identity at the same time. So that's Wang Gongyi. There is a fabulous oil painting that by Zhang Hongtu, a Chinese artist who lives in Brooklyn. And it is taken from a very, very famous album leaf this big in the Freer Museum by Shitall. And he does it, he calls it Shitall Van Gogh. He does it in Van Gogh style brushwork. So his thing is to take Chinese paintings and do them in Van Gogh or Cezanne or somebody. I mean, and it's kind of his thinking about his own cultural hybridity as a Chinese working in New York. And then on the opposite wall from that, we have a person born in Brooklyn, but working in Beijing, Michael Cherney, who is a photographer who rows over China and takes photographs of the landscape, manipulates those in a really, really interesting way, but a way that's also deeply informed by his knowledge of Chinese classical literature, and then he mounts them like a Chinese painting, so we have two hanging scrolls. So that's the current rotation. We try to rotate that part of that gallery, those two walls, about twice a year. The reality is that's very, very tough because I do not have enough Chinese paintings. I do not have enough. In general, I don't have enough East Asian paintings. I mean, I'm sort of constantly scrambling. But if we're sort of thinking about what happens at auction when I go, if I have, for example, I'm trying to buy a pot this year that costs $50,000. If I buy a pot that costs $50,000, I can have it on view all the time. And it may be that I need $75,000 to have a painting that I can have on view for 6 months, and then it has to sleep for 5 years. So it's hard to make the commitment for the painting. It has to be a spectacular painting, and we have to be able to afford it. If you can help us in that area, we'd be grateful.
Yeah, just one follow-up then. Is really the focus of this museum more on the art side versus objects or architectural elements?
Well, if we had an opportunity to buy architectural elements, I think we would jump on it. Space is certainly a concern, and if you know some of the other museums collecting in this area, I think Minneapolis, Cleveland, and Peabody, Essex in particular, I would love to have architectural elements. And I think as Maribeth said, we've been pretty much opportunistic, what comes our way, and finding our way. So always looking to take on new opportunities. So thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Good to see you. We have some upcoming conversations with other curators, Julia Dolan, Sarah Krajewski, Grace Cook-Anderson, and stay tuned for those. And thank you so much for being here, supporting this museum, and being part of this conversation. Thank you.